Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. In our history, Wales has a sad record of poverty, but as we get deeper into the 21st century, it is clear that this is not just part of our past, but a tragic part of the present day for many in Wales. The Bevan Foundation's latest work, A Snapshot of Poverty in Winter 2021, reported last week, with the key headline that nearly 4 in 10 Welsh households are struggling to make ends meet. Joining us tonight is the report's author, Dr. Steffan Evans, who's the head of policy, poverty, at the Bevan Foundation. Hi, Steph.
Hi, good evening.
Thanks for joining us. So the Bevan Foundation has got a long history of excellent work in this area, and I think it's fair to say that with Wales's long record of poverty, your latest research says that this is going to continue to be the case. Could you sort of talk us through some of the key aspects of this most recent piece of work?
Yeah, certainly. So, as you said, poverty has long been a problem in Wales. So, headed into the pandemic, not far off a quarter of people, about 700,000 people were living in poverty in Wales. And that was up to about 31% of children. So, the situation wasn't great. And frankly, there'd been virtually no progress in about a decade kind of heading up to the pandemic as well. But kind of what our latest research has done, it's third in a series of polls that YouGov have undertaken on our behalf, because obviously a lot of the official data is going to be quite badly out of date due to the impact of the pandemic. So the official poverty data in Wales, because the sample size is quite small, is averaged out over 3 years. So we're not really going to know the true extent of the impact of the pandemic on poverty by the official stats for another 2 or 3 years. So, by which point we're out of the crisis. So what we try to do is to get a sense of how a family's managing, and that gives us a proxy maybe in terms of poverty. And what that has shown is that, as you said, there's really high numbers of people really struggling. So nearly 4 in 10 Welsh households are now struggling to afford anything beyond the basics in Wales. And, the number of households who even struggle to do that now is more than the number of households there are in Cardiff. So the extent of the challenge really is quite clear now.
Those are some really shocking stats you just quoted there, Steph. I think 700,000 people, 31% of children. It is such sad reading, really. But I suppose it's that inequality that while incomes are falling, that's not for everyone. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that is really one of the stark things that comes out, and it actually follows. There was a similar pattern in our poll in May as well. So it shows that for those households with an income of over 40,000, and that's a combined income as well. So if it's 2 workers, the 2 of them, and includes benefits, 1 in 5 roughly, a bit more than that, saw their incomes increase since May. Whereas if you look at households with a combined income of less than 40,000, on average, 30% of those households saw their incomes decrease. So, this whole idea that, kind of building back better, kind of all that talk we heard a lot of in 2020, it's just not materialising. And there is that inequality baked into the recovery, or what recovery there is at the moment.
In the report, when you discuss living costs and the standard of living, the cost of living seems to be going up, and the standards of living of many people seem to be under quite a lot of pressure. Do you think the future is quite bleak in this area?
I think it's certainly a challenging few months ahead of us. So, as he said, living costs have undoubtedly gone up. This is something that's been in the news throughout the autumn, really, in terms of energy prices in particular. But that's really shone through in the data. So, 60% of households reporting, over 60% of households, I should say, reporting an increase in their utility bills. Over half reported an increase in the cost of food. And, that's before we enter the coldest months of the year, when people are going to, have to start to use even more energy. And that's on top of big increases that we'd seen in the period running up to May anyway. So these are increases on top of increases, and there's no real indication from experts in the field, on energy, on food, etc., that suggests there's any indication that those costs are going to come down anytime soon.
One of the areas I've worked on, Steph, is about the inequality and the poverty, because it's not across the board, really, is it? It hits some more than others. So low-income households, renters, disabled people, lone parents, they're more likely to be in poverty than other groups. Is that still the case? Did the research find anything that altered that kind of perspective?
No, absolutely. There's certainly some groups that are at greater risk. So Renters absolutely come through in this, and in particular because whilst homeowners broadly report not seeing an increase in their housing costs, that's really not the case for renters. So renters are having to manage all the other increases in costs that everyone else is seeing, and then managing an increase in their rent on top of that. And that's social and private sector. That's come through kind of over multiple surveys we've run. Disabled people, again, are another group that we have seen throughout these polls, and indeed in the poverty data. Really, it does have an impact. So, not far off, half of people living in poverty in Wales have a disabled family member. So, that is, so it's one of those kind of factors that not only has a high proportion, but also high numbers as well. So, if we want to make a real difference to poverty in Wales, that's something we need to get to grips with. Ethnicity is something that we aren't able to really tease out here because the sample size isn't big enough. But from the data we have elsewhere in the UK, I don't think it's, it'd be very strange if we weren't seeing similar patterns at play in Wales, where also some ethnic groups were also, minority ethnic groups were also at higher risk of living in poverty and feeling the pinch as well. So absolutely, there is that inequality between groups that really has an impact.
I did read the report, but I just want to check. Did I miss? Was there anything in there about poverty inequality between men and women, or is there anything background? Because that's something I was quite interested in as well.
Yeah, so we haven't got anything in the report because we've asked by household. So this is one of the challenges with calculating poverty, is that poverty tends to be calculated by household, which means it's quite difficult to extrapolate the experiences of men and women. Because when you look at a tradition, kind of a couple mixed sex households, couple households, their income is viewed as one, but there's obviously dynamics that might be at play within those households that mean that there's some data that suggests that women might be, have less access to that cash maybe than the man in that situation. So there is that undercurrent. Single parents, we know, are overwhelmingly women in terms of the data, and we know that single parents are a group that have really felt the pinch. So certainly in that context, we know that that's a context that women are likely to be feeling the pinch more than men.
Referring back again to the children stat you quoted earlier, and I think again, one of the things the Bevan Foundation does really well is highlight child poverty in Wales, which shames us all really in many ways. But can you talk us through a little bit of what the research found about children in poverty? That's still increasing in Wales, is that right?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that probably was starkest for us in terms of going through the data, and probably most concerning. We saw fairly high numbers reporting cutting back on stuff like, books, clothes for children, nappies, all of that sort of stuff. In particular, with regard to food for children, I think we have seen a step change from the previous polls we run. So for a household with 2 children, 10% are now reporting that they're cutting back on food for their children. And that's really concerning in itself. We know that long-term health and educational impact that's likely to have. But also, we weren't really seeing that in the early polls we were running. So the polls we ran back in May and around this time last year, that wasn't coming through as clear. But what was coming through then was seemingly parents were cutting back on food for themselves and to try and protect their children. So there's a concern, I think, but now that parents have exhausted their ability to cut back on themselves to protect their children, and are now having to cut back on their children as well. So I think you don't want to claim from the data because obviously there's margins of errors and stuff, but there does seem to be that shift, which is really troubling, if that does carry on that trend.
I think the research brought out a lot of really interesting points. And one bit which struck me was that 12% of Welsh households are at least a month behind with a bill. What is the situation with personal debt and money issues? Is it one of the kind of main factors around poverty in Wales?
So this is another one where the pandemic has really deepened existing inequality. So we did quite a bit of work on this over the summer, actually, because this was something that really caught our eye in the last survey we ran back in May. So what seems to have happened is, certainly up until the summer, the overall level of unsecured debt in the UK had actually fallen over the course of a pandemic. But what had happened, in essence, was that middle to upper income households had not been able to go out to restaurants, go on holidays, kind of go to places that they had used to be able to go and spend their money, and had therefore been able to pay down credit card debt, etc., that sort of stuff. Lower income households were already living on tight margins, so there wasn't really, when lockdown happened, there wasn't an awful lot cut anyway in people's expenditure, and also there wasn't, a lot of people were working in the sectors that medium to higher income households were going out and spending in, so they were maybe more likely to be on furlough or to have been made redundant, so they were seeing their incomes fall as well at the same time. So what we have seen is that for those groups, we know there's a link between poverty and debt, because obviously if you don't have a lot of money, of course, if one bill goes up, that increases your risk of falling behind on it. And so what we've seen is during the pandemic that those groups that were already at a higher risk of debt have in all likelihood seen their position deteriorate, whereas those groups that were already maybe in a more fortunate position were able to pay down a lot of the, kind of the softer debt that they might have built up over time.
I know Matt's got quite a few questions on the benefit system, but one area I just wanted to touch upon with you, and I'm not sure if your research got into it, was the UK levelling up agenda. We did a pod on it recently, and I think some of the conclusions we came from that were around the benefit system. But do you see the UK levelling up agenda, even in its infancy as it is now, having any impact in this area in Wales?
It has to tackle those inequalities that are baked into the system if it's going to mean anything. So, as we've already discussed, those inequalities of incomes that we're now seeing, so that those on the highest incomes are seeing their incomes go up, those on the lowest incomes are seeing their incomes go down. So if we don't target any levelling up funds, correctly, we risk turbocharging that inequality actually developing further within, even within our communities, let alone comparing the situation in parts of Wales versus elsewhere in the UK. And building on that then, in kind of the point we were talking about with debt as well, that's a similar process. So if people on lower incomes have built up debt over the past 12 to 24 months, even if income's recovered, a lot of that income, extra income anyone would be earning on the bottom end of the income distribution, they're going to have to be spending some of it paying down the debt they've built up over the course of a pandemic. So any improvement in their quality of life is going to be some way down the line compared to people who've been in a fortunate position and have been able to pay that off. So unless we tackle kind of both those factors, any increased investment is just going to entrench those inequalities that have developed.
Steph, so like Kerry warned you about, we're going to talk a little bit about the social security system now. It's been one of the most scrutinised parts of the state over the last 2 years or so. I mean, recently the Welsh Affairs Committee has been doing an inquiry into the benefit system in Wales. They've looked at both UK benefits delivered in Wales and also the creation of the, as it's been called, the Welsh benefit system. Would you be able to sort of create a distinction for our listeners between these two systems, as well as outline some of the problems and issues both these systems have with relation to how they contribute or alleviate poverty?
Yeah, so the Welsh benefit system, or the need for one, is something that we've done a lot of work on, actually, and I think we've been kind of maybe at the foreground, really, in terms of pushing this idea. So the idea came from it originally, when you talk about social security in a devolved context, often the answer from Welsh Government historically has been, well, it's terrible, isn't it? But there's not much we can do about it. But actually, we started thinking, about things like free school meals, council tax reduction scheme, poor education maintenance allowance, support for young learners. These are benefits. We either providing cash directly to families on a means test, or we providing support in lieu of cash, so providing something for free. And we did a bit of work, and we worked out that, going back now to 2019-20, that the amount of money that the Welsh Government was spending on this rag bag of grants and gifts was more than the UK government was spending on job seekers allowance and the work element of universal credit in Wales. So we've been spending a huge amount of money on what is essentially benefits, but haven't viewed it as a system. And that's where that idea comes from, is that by recognising that as part of one system, you can make it far easier for people to access. You can make the eligibility criteria more generous, so that you can help more people, and also you can make that support better as well. So it's basically something that complements and mitigates for the failures of the main UK social security system, so stuff like universal credit, housing benefits, etc. Those sorts of big benefits that people maybe associate more with when they're talking about benefits. Yeah, and it's something that we think can play a role. And I think we have seen Welsh Government growing confidence over the course of the pandemic on this as well. So the recent announcement, for example, of providing £100 to all households in receipt of universal credit to cope with winter fuel bills this winter. I don't think that would have happened a year ago. So I think there is a growing recognition maybe within Welsh Government and within Welsh, civil society more broadly, that there's probably more interest in stuff that we can do in this space to really help families, even if we can't get UK government to shift on some of the big problems with the UK system.
I mean, one of the biggest areas in which the Welsh benefit system and the limits thereof have been discussed in the last 6 months or so is the Welsh Government's basic income pilot, which is their care leavers income pilot. You would obviously be aware of the work done by the Future Generations Commission in relation to alternative basic income models. Would you be able to talk to us a little bit about the potential for a basic income to alleviate poverty in Wales and how realistic it is that a Welsh Government can take that forward?
Yeah, so it's one of those where what's devolved and isn't devolved, I think, is probably a bit more clear maybe in this space. So, so I think what we've learned from the pandemic is that, firstly, would it be easier to do different things if you had powers over social security devolved? Yes, because it's clear then what you're able to do and not. So, for example, in Scotland, where they've introduced the Scottish child payment, that's clearly devolved to Scotland. You don't need to be creative about coming up with things and trying to work it within your powers. So that gives you the ability to do so. So from the powers that the Welsh Government have, it's hard to see really that they currently got the powers to develop a basic income style model. So I guess the conversation then becomes about, if that's what you want to pursue, is how would you devolve those powers? How would you make it so that it worked, with the current system? And there's also, I guess, so one of the things that always comes up in discussions about devolving powers over social security is the costings of it. So, Welsh Government, I think, rightly have said that they wouldn't want to see powers devolved that would lead to them burdening, having to fund more of a system than is fair, given that Wales has higher rates of poverty, etc. So all those questions come into it. So basic income is one thing that you might be able to do that might be able to make a difference. But given that there's a lot of complications around whether they've got the powers to do it or not, there may be some more immediate things that Welsh Government could be able to do within that space. For example, talking about the Scottish child payment, building on the work that the Welsh Government has done with the Winter Fuel Fund, could Welsh Government be creative and change the development grant access so that the grant that low-income children from low-income families have in schools, could it be creative and just re-enable that the learner support fund or something, and just basically use it as a vehicle to give, create the child payment? So those are sort of questions I can imagine that, that we could look at maybe more in the space in terms of the current set of powers that the Welsh Government has.
Thinking now a little bit about powers that the Welsh Government wants, and as a really, really obvious bridge to talking about the cooperation agreement, we can see in the cooperation agreement that Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru are looking into the devolution of the administration of welfare. Why, for the benefit of our listeners, are Plaid and Labour calling for the devolution of the administration of welfare as opposed to the devolution of welfare? And is it simply because they're concerned about the financial ramifications or potential ramifications of that power being devolved?
Yeah, I suspect so. I think, and therefore it's easier to do, I guess. If you don't have to worry about working out the finances side of it, that becomes a bit easier to look at. So, and there's a range of stuff you could do here as well. So there's some really, really techy stuff. For example, so the local housing allowance determines how much housing benefit of housing element of universal credit a private renter, low-income private renter gets in Wales. That is determined according to what's called a broad rental market area. So basically kind of your local geography. That is determined by DWP, and the ones we've got in Wales bears no relation to any other tier of governance we have. And given how many different tiers of governance we have in Wales, that is some achievement. So that's something that is really super tacky. Probably wouldn't cost much to devolve that. So you could streamline that a bit, maybe easier across other public services. You're then looking at stuff where those powers are already devolved to Scotland. So, for example, as a default, universal credit payments are made monthly. And the idea is that then makes it more in line with work, that people get paid monthly. But that's a very middle class idea about how people get paid. A lot of people actually, especially at the lower end of the income distribution, get paid every week, every other week, ad hoc, etc. So what they've done in Scotland is to make it easier for people to have their payments twice a month. So that's something that, okay, is that going to radically reduce the number of people living in poverty? Probably not. But would it make life easier for those families? Probably yes. So that's the kind of stuff where you might be able to make a difference to people's lives in a way that they don't have to necessarily get involved in the whole cost conversation. Interestingly, previously Welsh government have been quite reluctant to discuss all of this stuff because their argument had been that they are against sanctions, understandably, and therefore they don't want any part to play in a system where sanctions remain. So sanctions is the idea that if you don't apply for enough jobs or don't turn up for an appointment, etc., the amount of benefits you get gets cut. And the Welsh government said, no, we don't want anything to do about that, therefore we don't want any powers over it. And our argument had always been, has been, well, yes, we understand that point, but at the same time, why wouldn't you want to make things easier for people, even within a system that we disagree with on sanctions? So that does seem to signal a shift from Welsh government to what the position was maybe 24 months ago. So that is something I suspect hasn't been talked about much, but that does seem a win for Plaid, actually. That is a step forward to maybe where the discussion had been recently.
You've thankfully crossed my really awkward bridge talking about the cooperation agreement, Steph. So what does this agreement mean for poverty in Wales? And to what extent do you think it will alleviate and eradicate poverty?
So I think it's definitely a major step forwards. There are policies in there that ourselves and others have been calling for a long time that will make life better for families. So the commitment that all primary school pupils are going to be getting free school meals in the next 3 years, and we're particularly pleased that that's got a date on it, because there's a lot in the cooperation agreement that's a bit vague, so we'll wait and see, whereas that's got a date on it. So that's something that maybe those of us, outside government can push. That's positive. Looking at council tax again is another positive step as well, because we know that's a particular problem maybe for low-paid workers, in particular low-income workers get really hit by that because you don't necessarily get access to support through the council tax reduction scheme. And there's things around childcare, which are going to be really positive. And also, whilst this is one of those areas where it's quite vague, but the recognition that we need to do more on housing affordability, I think, is also to be welcomed and will make a difference. I guess there are limitations to what the Welsh government through the cooperation can do in terms of eradicating poverty. If you have a UK government that is insistent on cutting the real terms values of social security benefits, that is going to inherently impact how effective your measures are going to be at reducing the overall headline number living in poverty. But what the commitments do mean is that even if we can't get the headline numbers down, we could see some improvement, but even if we can't get the headline numbers down, individual families will see their lives made better, than they would have been otherwise. So, so going back to the data we were talking at the start about 1 in 10 families with 2 children reporting that, they're cutting back on food for their children. Well, at least with universal school meals for all primary schools, those children are guaranteed 1 healthy meal a day, hot meal a day, in school. So it will make a difference to families. It will make lives better. And I think there is, it's definitely a step forward in the cooperation agreement. Would we like to see them do more? Absolutely. As ever, as you wouldn't be surprised, we want to see continual action. But I think it's definitely a step forward in recognising that there's more that we can do in Wales, even if the UK government is taking actions that we wouldn't necessarily agree with.
One of the areas you identify in the recent Bevan Foundation report is issues relating to housing, and sort of more than 1 in 20 households are worried about losing their home over the next 3 months. 6% of households have already been told that they will lose their home. To what extent do you think the cooperation agreement is dealing with the housing crisis?
So I think, it's a step forward that it recognises some of the challenges, so the fact that was vague on rent caps, that it recognises that that might be a route we can go down, I think, is positive. There's other issues beyond that as well. So, we did some work. I think the data is from 2016, but it's something that we're looking at the moment to do an updated piece of work on. But around £1 billion a year was spent on housing benefit in Wales in 2016. So that's £1 billion that's going on subsidising rents rather than subsidising the construction of new social housing that will be cheaper for people to rent, and kind of better, I'd argue, kind of better use of public funds. Because when you subsidise rents, you don't get much back for that. That money, especially in the private rental sector, that money just goes to landlords. You don't see much return on that. You don't have an asset at the end of it. You're just helping people in the short term in the housing. And I think there is a space maybe to move a conversation on a bit further as well, to kind of, so whilst it's great to see that controls on the private sector might be coming into our way of thinking, in the long term, does it make sense to continue to prop up the private rental market with state cash when we've got data from in the report we published back in September showing that for those on the lowest incomes who receive housing benefit of housing element universal credit, if they're looking to rent at the moment in Wales, their benefit only stretches to cover about 5% of the market, cover the rent in full. So, so the system doesn't work as it is, and we're trying to top that up. So rent controls might be a part of the answer in the short term, but maybe hopefully the agreement opens up the space to have those discussions about longer term, moving away and thinking a bit deeper about affordability, rather than just the headline stuff maybe that has been the tendency over recent years.
There was a report from the Social Justice and Equality Committee of the Senedd recently, which said that the worst was yet to come for the most vulnerable in Welsh society. Do you think that's still the case? Do you think that with the cooperation agreement in place, there are, serious efforts underfoot to change that situation? Do you think things like the launch of the winter fuel support scheme really make a difference to people's lives, or do you think they are just sort of papering over the cracks of a much more broad and systemic problem?
I think there's probably worse to come this winter. I think the winter fuel scheme is absolutely to be welcomed. £100 is a lot of money for anyone, let alone for people on the lowest incomes, and that will make a difference to people at a challenging time of year. But that covers up basically 5 weeks worth of universal credit cut. So, by the middle of February, the value of that in relation to, what households are losing out on will have been washed away. Now, that's not to say that they shouldn't have done it. It's good that they've done it. It's better than had they not. But given that, we're still heading into the coldest months with very, high numbers of households, already reporting cutting back on their energy costs, I think it's likely that we're going to see more households do that. I guess there are some stuff in the cooperation agreement that hints at maybe a better future where households will have more of their basic needs covered. And the positive thing from the survey as well was that we found that there is public support for Welsh Government taking more action in this field. So the cooperation agreement does provide a hint that there could be a better future, but that is set against a challenging economic landscape in terms of employment, and also against a challenging landscape at Westminster, where there is no real indication that the government is serious about kind of reforming the social security system in terms of making it more generous to people as well.
Steph, one thing people talk to me a lot about is the Welsh government's sort of trepidation to use their tax powers in order to redistribute wealth or to fund other public services. Do you think that as things get harder for people, the Welsh government should really consider using its taxation levers to try and alleviate some of the poverty and the concern of people in Wales?
Yeah, well, I think inevitably those questions are going to arise. I think, it's not something I've done a lot of work on personally, but I've always remember a presentation that Gito Ivan from the Wales Governance Centre did, looking at council tax versus income tax in terms of the impact of rising both. Back just before the pandemic, I think, where he showed that rising income tax by 1p in the pound and freezing council tax allows you to raise the same amount of money, but in a far more progressive way than relying on council tax to do the heavy lifting for you. So that's one example of maybe where we could look at in future, will that come up in the discussions on council tax reform? I'm not sure, but that's certainly something that stayed with me in terms of where we could do choices that would be more progressive in the way that we fund public services.
The one thing which struck me from the cooperation agreement that there's a word that doesn't really feature much, and that's the economy. It only appears twice, and once is in relation to net zero, and once is in the context of education. Do you think that's a glaring omission, or do you think what is in there makes up for that?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting omission. I think, it's. I guess Welsh Government would argue that there was stuff in the programme for government outside the cooperation agreement. But I think it is an important space. And things like things that were in the programme for government that you'd want to see taken forward in that space is stuff around the Fair Work agenda. The work of the Fair Work Commission. How can we get more people paid the real living wage in Wales? How can we improve terms and conditions in the workplace? That stuff matters as well, and it's important that we take that forward and we try and grow the economy by working with that at the front of what we're trying to achieve. So I think it is something that you may well have expected to see more of, probably.
I got a question forming in my head, but one of the ones I did want to ask you while we've got you is that just building on what Victoria Winkler from the Bevan Foundation, you may know her, said in a recent pod. It was around the education maintenance allowance, and that's a bit of an issue really at the moment, isn't it? Can you talk us through a little bit more on that aspect?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely one of the major omissions, as far as I'm concerned, from the cooperation agreement is the support available for young adults and older children. So, there's lots of really good things in the cooperation agreement for younger children, I think. So we've talked about school meals and childcare already, but there's nothing in there about expanding school meals for secondary school pupils. And we know there's a lot of children missing out on school meals there who are living in poverty. And you've mentioned the education and maintenance allowance. So that provides £30 a week for children from lower income households to continue in education between 16 and 18. That has not increased since I think around saying 2004-5. So it was £30 a week then. When we kind of ran that numbers through kind of the inflation calculators, if it had increased in line with inflation, it would now be at £45 a week. So that's a huge difference in terms of the value of that support that's missing. And also, they haven't increased the eligibility income threshold either. So the young people getting that support are now poorer than their peers were when that support was introduced back in 2004-5. And the Welsh Government has always argued that we've defended EMA in Wales, compare that with England, where EMA has been got rid of. But, I'd question how, long term, are you really defending it, when you're reducing the value of something in that way? And so given that it wasn't in the cooperation agreement, we can assume that it'll be frozen again for another 3 years. So that's 20 years there of a benefit not being increased, not being uprated. So its value for society is going to be reducing. And I think it's made even more curious when you think that there's actually quite generous support available for students from low-income households, so get far more grant funding, to cover, don't have to face as many loans as children from, middle to higher income households. But are we losing young people from the system between 16 and 18 because they can't afford to hang on until that more generous support becomes available at 18? So I think there's that's a real gap that we really need to look at. And in particular, given that, going back to what you were talking about, the economy, that gap in the, challenging labour market, we should be doing everything we can to encourage young people to stay and develop their skills so that they can go maybe for higher qualified jobs. And that gives them a better chance in life in terms of avoiding being in low paid sectors and at risk of poverty.
I'm going to go a little bit off script now, Steph, sorry. So it's not based on the research we did for the paper. But I worked in this area a long time ago, and one of the pieces of work I ended up contributing to, we were suggesting that to tackle this kind of poverty in Welsh communities, it had to be a cross-government approach, and we had to put massive funding into the big. So we haven't talked about health tonight, but health, education, economy, and do it in that kind of huge scale. I think the research I looked at was showing where poverty had really been addressed was on those massive interventions and piecemeal approaches. And what I was looking at it from was regeneration, but we were very much driving towards a pan-government kind of conclusion. Would you think that kind of position still stands? That if we're going to address the endemic poverty we've got in Wales, it's got to be massive intervention across all those sectors, pan-government, to have that kind of lasting impact?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, and I think, so going back to, maybe to the fundamentals of why do people live in poverty? Well, first, work is not enough of it for everyone, and the work that is available isn't enough, to pay people well and good terms and conditions for people. The social security system doesn't provide people with, for those people who can't work, with a good safety net, and for those who do work, that top up to make up for the fact that work, isn't good enough. And living costs are too high, in particular housing and childcare are two big ones, but probably chuck energy in that at the moment as well. And whilst sometimes it feels a bit old school and kind of people say, oh, haven't we done that before, about you need to do something on each of those things to see a difference. But arguably, we've never actually done it. We've done small scale things on each of these, but actually it costs to do the big investment, but you need to do that to see the returns as well. So, and I think you're absolutely right, in terms of that there is a tendency to be piecemeal. And I understand in the devolved context, there's limitations as well through the funding formula, etc. It's not, Welsh government can't, if it so chose, just whack up income tax and come up with a wealth tax, etc., etc. But, that is fundamentally what we still haven't done as a society is that large scale investment in each of those solutions to each of those causes.
On which point I would encourage anyone who can get hold of Vibrant and Viable Places Regeneration Strategy, do read it. Fantastic document and not followed at all. So
sure, the PDF is hanging around somewhere on the Welsh Government website, Kerry.
I'm happy to circulate to anyone who wants it.
Steph, thank you so much for coming on to talk to us. Before you go, Christmas coming up, if you had one gift that you could request in terms of dealing with poverty in Wales, what would you do? What would be the one big wish list item for you that could make a real significant difference? Or as you and Kerry just been saying, is that just too simple a way of looking at poverty? Does it need to just such a holistic approach to poverty that even trying to break it down into individual actions is just far too simplistic?
I think you're right. I think it's about us having it at the front of our minds with everything we do policy-wise. It has an impact on everything. It's pervasive throughout Welsh society. And, the fact that we had 700,000 people living in poverty even before the pandemic, I think, it's a stat that I think people maybe know about it somewhere, but, that should be at the centre of our politics all the time, and I think having that sense of urgency that we need to do something and doing things, I think is as important, and even if we are taking piecemeal measures, well, let's take them, let's get them done, and let's build on them and do more. So free school meals for all primary school children. Well, let's not wait 3 years. Let's get as much of that done as we can, and then once we've done that, let's look at secondary school children. So kind of building on the work we're doing all the time to create that urgency and to take that action.
Okay, I lied. I've got one more question, Steph. If we have to have poverty at the front of our mind in everything we do in government, if you have to have the environment at the front of your mind in everything you do in government, if you have to have recovery from COVID-19 at the front of your mind in everything you do in government, is there not a danger that instead of focusing on one and doing it well, that you try and focus on too many things, split your attention, and end up not satisfactorily dealing with any of those major problems that we face?
I think that's a good question, but I think you have to, because they're interlinked. And so we've been doing some work with communities across Wales over the last year, kind of, getting people's lived experience of poverty and different challenges. And we had a discussion a few weeks ago with a community in Cardiff, and one thing really stood out at me was kind of how failing to take action on one thing risks another. So there was a concern about quality of kind of maintenance in some social housing. Someone had been waiting for a new kitchen had been promised for 2 years and had now been said, due to the fact that we're doing decarb retrofitting, we probably won't have the money to give you a new kitchen, which had instantly turned this person, understandably, against the measures we need on the climate emergency. So, I think that shows, that both these things have to be taken forward together, because, you're not going to get support for the action we need on the climate unless we eradicate and reduce poverty, and we're not going to, achieve what, kind of vice versa as well. So I think that shows that thinking holistically about them has to be really important.
Dr. Steffan Evans, thank you very much for coming on to talk to us. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on Twitter?
I'm at Steph H. Evans, or at the Bevan Foundation as well, or at Bevan Foundation, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Steph. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please do not forget to find us on Medium at Here I Blog Cymru, on Facebook at Here I Blog Cymru, and on Twitter at Here I Blog. Thank you for listening to Here I. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.